The United Kingdom began a military intervention in Sierra Leone on 7 May 2000 under the codename Operation Palliser, although small numbers of British personnel had been deployed previously. Palliser was the first large-scale intervention by British forces in the Sierra Leone Civil War. In early May 2000, the Revolutionary United Front, one of the main parties to the Civil War, advanced on the country's capital, Freetown, prompting the British government to dispatch an operational reconnaissance and liaison team to prepare to evacuate foreign citizens. On 6 May, the RAF blocked the road connecting Freetown to the country's main airport, Lungi. The next day, British soldiers began to secure the airport and other areas essential to an evacuation. The majority of those who wished to leave were evacuated within the first 2 days of the operation, but many chose to stay following the arrival of British forces. After the effective completion of the evacuation, the mandate of the British forces began to expand. They assisted with the evacuation of besieged peacekeepers, including several British ceasefire observers, and began to assist the United Nations mission in Sierra Leone and the Sierra Leone Army. Despite the mission expansion, it was not until the 17th of May that British soldiers came into direct contact with the RAF. The rebels attacked a British position near Lungi Airport, but were forced to retreat after a series of firefights. On the same day, the RUF's leader, Foday Sanko, was captured by Sierra Leonean forces, leaving the RAF in disarray. After deciding that the RAF would not disarm voluntarily, the British began training the SLA for a confrontation. During the training mission, a patrol returning from a visit to Jordanian peacekeepers was taken captive by a militia group known as the West Side Boys. Negotiations achieved the release of 5 of the 11 soldiers, and 3 weeks into the crisis, British Special Forces launched a mission codenamed Operation Palliser, freeing the remaining 6. The success of Operation Palliser restored confidence in the British mission. One academic suggested that its failure would have forced the British government to withdraw all its forces from Sierra Leone. The overall British operation was mostly completed by September 2000. The RAF began to disarm after political pressure, and later economic sanctions were exerted on Liberia, which had supported the RAF in exchange for conflict diamonds smuggled out of Sierra Leone. The Sierra Leonean government eventually signed a ceasefire with the RAF that obliged the latter to enter the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process. By September 2001, when the British training teams were replaced by an international force, the DDR process was almost complete. British forces continued to be involved in Sierra Leone by providing the largest contribution of personnel to the international training team and advising on a restructuring of Sierra Leone's armed forces. A small force was deployed to the area in 2003 to ensure stability, while several indictments and arrests were made by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The success of British operations in Sierra Leone vindicated several concepts, including the retention of high readiness forces. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was keen to see Western interventions in other conflicts, and, along with France, supported the creation of several European Union battle groups for the purpose. As it happened, political opposition and later British commitments in Afghanistan and Iraq prevented further British operations in Africa. Background: Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a country in West Africa, close to the equator, with an area of 71,740 square kilometers, similar in size to South Carolina or Scotland. It shares land borders with Guinea and Liberia and is bordered to the west by the Atlantic Ocean. The country became a British colony in 1808, though British influence began in the late 18th century when million former slaves were settled in the area that became known as Freetown, now the capital city. Freetown lies on a peninsula, and is separated from the country's main airport, Lungi, by the estuary of the Sierra Leone River, which is several miles wide. The colony was granted independence from the United Kingdom in 1961, and Sir Milton Margai was appointed its first Prime Minister. He was replaced in 1962 by his brother Albert, who was defeated by Siaka Stevens in the 1967 general election. Stevens was overthrown within hours by the commander of the army, but was later reinstated after the commander was himself overthrown. Sierra Leone became a republic in 1971, and Stevens was installed as its first president. In 1978, Sierra Leone formally became a one-party state, and the All People's Congress became the only legal political party. Stevens retired in 1985 and appointed Joseph Momo as his successor. Momo was accused of corruption and abuse of power, and the Revolutionary United Front was formed later in the decade with the aim of overthrowing him. Sponsored by Liberia, the RUF began attacking settlements along the border in 1991 and quickly took control of the diamond mines, whose products they smuggled through Liberia and traded for weapons. The following years saw a series of coups and interventions by private military companies, Nigeria, the Economic Community of West African States, and the United Nations, while a bloody civil war devastated the country. On 7 July 1999, the Lomé Peace Accord was signed. Among other provisions, the agreement mandated an immediate ceasefire between the main parties to the civil war and the disarmament of the Sierra Leone Army and the RUF. It also gave the RUF status as a legitimate political party, a role in the Sierra Leone government, and 4 of the 22 seats in the cabinet. Fode Sanko, leader of the RUF, was given responsibility for the diamond mines, an appointment much criticized by observers and the international media given the RUF's history of diamond smuggling. However, Peter Hain, Minister of State for Africa, suggested that the British government had no choice but to endorse the Lomé Agreement given the RUF's dominance, and that the only alternative was continued civil war. A military intervention by the United Kingdom in 1999 was ruled out as the British government had received no request for military assistance and felt it lacked the backing of the international community for a unilateral intervention. An intervention was also deemed to be politically and militarily impractical given the British military's involvement with NATO operations in Yugoslavia, Tony Blair and the British Armed Forces. The intervention in Sierra Leone was the 4th expeditionary operation and the 2nd significant deployment undertaken by Her Majesty's Armed Forces under Tony Blair, who was elected as Prime Minister in 1997. The first 2 were relatively minor operations, a series of airstrikes against Iraq in 1998 codenamed Operation Desert Fox, and a deployment of a company of Gurkhas and special forces on peacekeeping operations in East Timor in 1999. The third operation, the first major deployment under Blair, was in Kosovo in 1999, where British forces led a NATO intervention in the Kosovo War. During the British operations in Kosovo, Blair delivered a speech in Chicago, in which he outlined his doctrine of the international community. Blair advocated a greater use of humanitarian intervention, the use of armed force to protect a civilian population, rather than exclusively to protect national interests. Kosovo did not diminish Blair's belief in the use of military force for humanitarian purposes where a strong moral case could be made, and he outlined a set of criteria for intervention. The intervention in Sierra Leone, according to Andrew M. Dorman of King's College London, appears to embody much of the ethos contained within previous British deployments. The intervention in May 2000 was the first major deployment of British forces to Sierra Leone during the Civil War, but was not the first time British personnel had served there. In May 1997, a two-man training team from the British Army was sent to train SLA officers but discovered that the SLA's strength was much lower than it had reported. The government was overthrown in a coup before any training could take place. Following the restoration of the elected government by the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group in February 1998, HMS Cornwall sailed to Freetown with food and medical supplies. Her crew assisted with infrastructure repairs and her helicopter was used to move people and supplies around Sierra Leone until she left in mid-April. As the security situation in Sierra Leone deteriorated later in the year, the Royal Air Force conducted a non-combatant evacuation operation under the codename Operation Palliser over Christmas 1998. Approximately 80 people, predominantly British citizens, many of them staff or dependents from the British High Commission, were evacuated over 2 days. In January 1999, the RAF attacked Freetown. They were pushed back to the eastern edges of the city by ECOMOG, after which HMS Norfolk was sent to offer assistance. On arrival, a team from the Department for International Development was based on board the ship to assist the crew's efforts. Peter Penfold, the British High Commissioner, who had been evacuated to Guinea, temporarily lived on the ship before it was deemed safe for him to return to his residence in Freetown. He flew ashore on the Norfolk's helicopter for daily meetings, with a detachment of Royal Marines ensuring security. HMS Norfolk was replaced by HMS Westminster, shortly after which Penfold moved back to his residence and the Royal Marines took over security of the compound temporarily. The fighting was eventually ended by the Lomé Peace Accord, which was signed in July 1999. The United Nations Observer Mission to Sierra Leone was replaced with the United Nations Mission in Sierra Leone, which included a force of 260 military observers. The observers were unarmed and tasked with monitoring the ceasefire mandated by the Lomé Agreement. The observer force, like UNAMSIL itself, was primarily made up of personnel from other African nations, but the United Kingdom contributed a small number of officers from the British Army and Royal Marines. In addition to the observers in Sierra Leone, personnel from the Royal Logistic Corps were serving in New York, assisting UNAMSIL with organizing airlifts to bring the mission up to its authorized strength. Build up to the intervention. In accordance with the Lomé Agreement, UNAMSIL set up disarmament camps throughout Sierra Leone that were intended to disarm the Sierra Leone Army, the RAF and the militia groups operating in the country. The SLA and some militia groups began to enter the camps but the RAF did not. In April 2000, 10 members of the RAF entered a UNAMSIL camp without the knowledge of the RUF's leadership. Upon locating its fighters, the RAF demanded the return. The military observers refused, and the RAF responded by besieging the camp and attacking other UNAMSIL bases in the area. They took large numbers of UN personnel prisoner, and then began to advance into areas previously controlled by the Sierra Leone government. On the 3rd of May, the RAF took control of the town of Cambia. Foreign diplomats in the country estimated that the RAF could be in Freetown within a week, since the SLA had been confined to barracks and had handed over most of its weapons in accordance with the Lomé Agreement. The United Nations issued a statement condemning the violence, after which Secretary-General Kofi Annan told the British representative to the UN that it expected the United Kingdom, as the former colonial power, to intervene in Sierra Leone directly, rather than relying on the international community. On the 5th of May, the British government continued to state that it would provide only logistical and technical support to UNAMSIL, but was privately exploring its options for a military deployment. The United Kingdom had a greater level of political involvement in Sierra Leone than in any other African country, and, with the country's stability deteriorating, it was reluctant to see that investment wasted. In addition, an estimated 1,000 entitled personnel were in Sierra Leone, and the government feared for the safety. Academics have since suggested that the credibility of UNAMSIL and future UN peacekeeping operations would have been at stake had the mission in Sierra Leone been allowed to fail. The British armed forces were not as widely deployed in 2000 as they were to be later in the decade. The British Army had 2 brigades serving with NATO in the Balkans, and the Ministry of Defence had ongoing commitments to Cyprus, the Falkland Islands, and elsewhere. But the armed forces, particularly units threatened by proposed cuts to the defence budget, were keen to participate in an operation. Senior officers thus advised the government that an operation in Sierra Leone was feasible. Over the following days, there was debate within the British government as to what the aims of a military deployment to Sierra Leone would be. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office advocated a full-scale intervention to assist UNAMSIL, arguing that a non-combatant evacuation operation would not be sufficient and would undermine the UN. But the MOD believed that the armed forces would be unable to sustain a larger-scale operation. The British government's Emergency Committee, COBRA, was convened and presented with 3 options for an evacuation of entitled persons, deployment of aircraft and special forces to conduct an evacuation via Lungi Airport, deployment of regular ground forces for a similar operation, or rerouting the amphibious ready group. COBRA concluded that it lacked sufficient information to recommend one of the 3 options and instructed the MOD to continue to develop them, while also recommending that an operational reconnaissance and liaison team be sent to Sierra Leone to assess the situation and advise on how the military could be useful. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, approved the ORLT, which was led by Brigadier David Richards, Chief of Joint Force Operations. Richards had previously visited Sierra Leone twice during the Civil War, first on the HMS Norfolk in early 1999 and again in early 2000, and was familiar with the political leadership of the country. He and his team left from RAF Northolt 8 hours later, accompanied by Close Protection Force, and arrived in Freetown in the early hours of the 6th of May. The ORLT established itself in the British High Commission in Freetown, where daily political-military coordination meetings were held throughout the operation. The readiness of several other assets was heightened on the 5th of May. 2 Royal Navy vessels, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious and the frigate HMS Argyle, were ordered to sail to the area, as was the ARG. The Standby Special Forces Squadron and 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment were both ordered to prepare for a potential operation in Sierra Leone, and several RAF transport aircraft were taken off other duties and ordered to be prepared to airlift special forces and/or 1 para to Lungi Airport. At the same time, 4 RAF CH-47 Chinooks were ordered to deploy to Sierra Leone, 2 from the Balkans and 2 from the base in the United Kingdom. The RAF lacked aircraft large enough to transport Chinooks, and so the helicopter crews flew themselves to Freetown. The 3,000-mile flight undertaken by the 2 aircraft based in the UK was the longest self-deployment of helicopters in British history. Operation Palliser, On the 6th of May, the RAF blocked the road connecting Freetown to Lungi Airport, prompting UNAMSIL staff to evacuate to the Mami Yoko Hotel in preparation for a total withdrawal from Sierra Leone if the RAF advance continued towards Freetown. In response to the deterioration, Richards requested that British troops be sent to Dakar, Senegal, to decrease the time required to launch an operation in Sierra Leone. Richards also spoke to the 1 Para Command to update them on the situation. Following the conversation, 1 Para moved to the Air Movements Centre in South Cerney, Gloucestershire. The following day, Richards was designated Joint Task Force Commander and his ORLT became the forward headquarters for a British deployment. At the same time, the authority to launch an evacuation operation was delegated to Richards and the British High Commissioner, Alan Jones, with the RAF rapidly advancing on Freetown and controlling most of the interior of Sierra Leone. The only means of rapidly evacuating entitled persons or reinforcing UNAMSIL was by air via Lungi Airport. Thus, the enhanced 1 Para was flown to Dakar on the 7th of May, where C Company and the Special Forces Squadron were almost immediately put aboard RAF Hercules C-130S with orders to secure the airport. They arrived at Lungi before sunset and were joined by the remaining elements of 1 Para the next morning. The soldiers were able to deploy rapidly and with minimal equipment, knowing that they would not have to wait long for the ARG's reinforcements and supplies should they be needed. The soldiers immediately set about securing the areas that would be vital to an evacuation, including the Mami Yoko Hotel, which became the evacuation center, and Lungi Airport. Jones requested in the afternoon of the 8th of May that Richards commence the evacuation, codenamed Operation Palliser, which Richards did almost immediately. Entitled persons who wished to leave were instructed to assemble at the Mami Yoko Hotel. For that, they would be helicoptered to the airport by Chinooks and then flown to Dakar. Over the course of a week, British forces evacuated approximately 500 entitled persons from Sierra Leone, almost 300 of whom left in the first 2 days of the operation. The arrival of British soldiers boosted morale in the country, and many foreign citizens opted to stay. The operation took on a slower pace after the first 2 days, but personnel and aircraft remained ready to evacuate any entitled persons who had been unable to reach Freetown earlier and to evacuate the British High Commission if the security situation deteriorated.